Francesco Boldizzoni joins us now. He works as a professor of political science at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. Francesco, thank you so much for your time. There are so many reviews of your books. There was one in The Spectator, and Frank Lawton in it said, well, he asked a question. He said, what is the problem people have with capitalism? And he answered it with a sort of sarcastic rhetorical question, saying that essentially capitalism has been so utterly successful that actually people can't really have a problem with it. And he says in your book, you don't really argue about the success of capitalism. But how much longer do you think it can survive in its current form?
Actually, capitalism has produced a lot of poverty, especially during the past 30 years when it has been left unchecked. What used to be the affluent societies of the West are now being torn apart by unbearable levels of inequality, while a new underclass of precarious workers struggle to make ends meet. And the countries in the global South that have managed to develop have largely done so despite the global dominance of capitalism. So the point I make in the book is a different one. Whether we like it or not, capitalism is here to stay, at least in this part of the world. Economic growth may well come to a standstill, but this will only exacerbate the current trend toward rent extraction and social conflict.
The social conflict seems fairly apparent in, you think of France and the Yellow Vest movement. And I'd heard a story of a grandfather who was part of the Yellow Vest protests. He said, I literally cannot afford to take my grandchildren to eat at McDonald's. But they don't seem to be having that much of an effect on Emmanuel Macron. There may be little tweaks here and there, but they're looking for a longer-term solution which will provide, as you say, more equality. So where are the changes going to come from? Because is it not apparent that we have become kind of trapped in a system that promises endless growth and that people have been persuaded that capitalism is the thing that is actually going to save them, not drown them?
Well, for sure, the tendency to consolidate economic privilege and disparities is intrinsic to capitalism, especially to capitalism in its current neoliberal form. And this tendency is just a reflection of the power imbalances that exist in society. However, I believe capitalism can also be tamed and forced to operate for the common good. And this is what a modern state should do. I think much of the social protest and anger we have recently seen in France and elsewhere in Europe, more than towards capitalism as such, is directed against the state, which has abdicated this critical function. In this sense, the Macron presidency embodies the failure of a state that has turned its back on the more vulnerable sections of society and has chosen to side with the powerful.
Frank Lawton in The Spectator also says in his review of your book, he says there's no such thing as one homogenous type of capitalism. He says rather you have to appreciate the cultural context in which capitalism operates, and therefore there are capitalisms, plural. I wonder if you think that possibly the Scandinavian model may be something that more neoliberal extreme countries might care to adopt. As far as I understand it, in Scandinavia, not everywhere, but in a large part of Scandinavia, there is a trade-off that the citizenry understands, that if I earn a lot of money, I'm going to pay a lot of tax, up to 90% possibly I'm going to pay in tax, but the trade-off I'm going to get is going to be a safe environment for me and my family, and the state is going to take care of me as a citizen. Can you imagine there being, for example, 90% tax on billionaires on anything they earn over maybe $100 million in the United States? Could that ever happen?
Well, that's true. Capitalism, like any other economic system, comes in varieties. There are huge differences, say, between the savage capitalism you find in the US and the much milder Nordic varieties. Scandinavians have a low tolerance for inequality and a rather pragmatic attitude to conflict management. In Norway, where I normally live, the line between capitalism and socialism is particularly blurred, given the overwhelming role that the public sector plays in economic life. However, it's difficult to point to any economic model as an example to emulate, precisely because of the culture-specific nature of these models. What one can do is to see what aspects can be applied elsewhere by working within existing constraints. And well, the fixation with the billionaires or the 1% that you find, especially in the US these days, risks being a distraction from a more basic issue that I believe should be addressed first in that context. Basically, you can't build a proper welfare state, providing everyone with free healthcare, quality education, and so on, out of billionaire wealth alone. Everybody must contribute according to their means. And here I think Americans have a big problem with their middle classes, especially the upper middle classes, who pay a ridiculously low amount of taxes and are reluctant to give more. They feel untouchable because they make a large section of the population and politicians need their votes. But unless this structural obstacle is overcome, the system can't be reformed.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the welfare state there, Francesco, because going back to the yellow vests, and they're exactly saying that, is that the capitalist system in our country has produced a system which clearly is only taking care of the minority, not us, the majority. Let me just end by asking you about the idea of degrowth, because we have this idea that capitalism promises growth upon growth upon growth. And yet, in terms of, say, for example, natural resources, we seem to be extracting more from the earth than can be naturally replenished. And that kind of system is obviously going to fall flat on its face. What do you think of the idea of degrowth as a way towards the future? In other words, not completely taking away every single cent, for example, from the fossil fuel industry, but slowly weaning the world off it and putting it into more sustainable methods of survival.
Well, Adnan, I'm 100% environmentalist. However, I don't think degrowth can really provide the final answer to the problems.
Chuck, you just do me.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Sorry. Can I go on?
Yes, please.
Oh, sorry. Because Europe, for example, is already approaching zero economic growth. Yet it's not that greed disappears when we switch off the growth engine. In fact, the smaller the wealth pie, the more intense distributional conflict becomes. The key is rather how you cut the slices, I think. And I personally favor a social democratic management of capitalism, which can well be a green one, of course, why not? But one that is fundamentally based on three elements. That is a highly progressive tax system, capital controls, and a strong public sector. On the one hand, as I mentioned earlier, you can't get a comprehensive and universalist welfare state without tax justice. On the other, more extensive public ownership in key industries and the banking sector is needed to stop the ongoing race to the bottom in the labor market. And also as a tool against, I would say, capitalist arrogance. So I think the state's direct involvement in economic life would send capitalists a powerful message. As long as you cooperate for the common good, we can get along. But if you break the social contract, the state will be ready to put you back on the right track.
Francesco, thank you so much indeed. Sorry for the confusion there. I was just trying to talk to my producer in the gallery. You know what TV is like. Francesco Boldizzoni, thanks so much. Take care.
Having me.